Hello and welcome to this InflectraCON 2023 virtual bonus session. InflectraCON will be held from April 19th through the 21st in Washington, D.C. on the campus of Gallaudet University. We are looking forward to 3 days of customer training, partner meetings, industry sessions, networking, and more. Check us out at www.inflectracon.com. This session is led by Anastasios Daskalopoulos, Director of Quality Automation at DemandBridge. Let's get started with this virtual bonus session entitled Defining Successful DevOps Test Automation.
Welcome to InflectraCON 2023. Today, what are we going to be talking about? We'll be talking about defining successful DevOps test automation. And let's start off with who I am. My name is Anastasios Daskalopoulos. I'm the Director of Quality Automation for DemandBridge LLC in Hunt Valley, Maryland. And let's talk about what I've done. Who am I to talk about test automation? Well, let me see. For name again, Anastasios Daskalopoulos. I've been a professional software tester since 2023. Amazing, 20 years. I've served in every area of software testing, from manual testing to test automation, to test management. And now I specialize in test ops, test DevOps, test automation in DevOps, whatever you wish, however you wish to call it. But basically it's test automation in the DevOps framework and environment. But let's talk about this. Let's talk about defining successful DevOps test automation and contrast how things were 20 years ago with how they are now. Let's put some context into this. What was, or what is, we can still say, the goal of software testing? And we can ask, again, has the goal or main purpose changed at all? Let's talk about how the field's changed. Let's go back 20 years ago. Software testing back then consisted of what we'd call today manual testing. And back then, in most companies that did have a formal software testing practice, there was a large group of testers in one big room, and everybody executed pre-written, manually executed test cases, all together, sitting side by side in a big room. But what's changed? Obviously, changes in technology, software development, and ways of working, have led to changes in software testing. For the sake of clarity, hereafter we'll also refer to software testing as quality assurance, of course, or just QA. What else has changed? The speed of development cycles. In the world of way back, in the world of the classic waterfall model, there was a long development phase followed by a long testing phase. And both of these phases could last weeks, even months, really. And now, of course, there were new ways of working. There have been changes to personnel in general. There are much smaller teams, even for developers. Project teams or pods even consist of maybe 5 to 10 people, depending on the company. And the days of large rooms with dozens of testers all executing test cases manually, sitting side by side, are basically gone. Today, we need to talk about speed. A common response to QA from development managers, from my experience, is some say we just don't have time to test. Well, the same development managers will almost always, in my experience, include a 30-day bug fix period. Another thing they say is budget. Another common response to QA from development managers is we just don't have the budget for testing. And ironically, the same 30-day bug fix period that these development managers insist on wastes huge amounts of money and time, which could otherwise be charged to the client for profit. And so a good way to counter these two arguments is DevOps. We can use the test phase included in the DevOps practice, which we'll have a look at here. This is a simple chart, a simple diagram of how DevOps can look like. Let's talk DevOps. Basically is a plan, code, build, and test practice on the development side, followed by the release, deploy, operate, and monitor side of the ops side. And test is a big part of this. It's right before release, and we can take advantage of this process to have successful practices, which aren't really all that different from how they were back then. But how was test automation back then? Since DevOps is basically tied up with test automation. Back then, test automation was more of a click and record system that played back exactly what you recorded. But there were excellent tools that did exist back then. My favorite of like 15 years ago, 16 years ago now, was Quick Test Professional, which may or may not be available, but there are other numerous tools now available which you can have your choice of. And how can we define a successful DevOps test automation now versus then? Back then, test automation was regarded as a quick way to execute smoke tests, or as a more distant regression test set. Test automation was something like either quickly done or which was a smoke test, or was a long-term, basically constantly executed regression set. Let's talk about the present. What can we do going forward? What goes on today in QA and DevOps? From my experience, they're much smaller, of course, QA teams. And very often a QA team, in my experience, consists of a team of one. Very often in companies that I've been in, I have been the QA person. I have been the tester. And for that reality, testing has to go very quickly. You have to have fast testing, which for me, for a successful testing practice, has meant exploratory testing and test automation, both of which we'll talk about in detail. But where we see test in DevOps is that in a DevOps diagram, in the DevOps plan, you have like the figure 8 diagram, which we've seen. And the test part is right before the release, but testing, in my experience, can be done all throughout the whole dev procedure. So testing can start as early as possible. And what makes this kind of test automation different? The best is speed. Since there are very quick, very fast development cycles that we have to deal with these days, speed is a necessity in creating basically a sufficient number of tests that provide adequate information for the release of a system. So the reality is you need to write a lot of tests, and you need to write a lot of tests very quickly. And not only that, but these also have to be very accurate tests to really accurately give information about the reality of the system under test. That is, your tests have to find a lot of bugs, and your tests also need to relay any information, or as much information as possible, about the stability of the system. And let's talk about quickly, let's just bring up the question, is manual test case creation and execution even possible now? In this world of Agile, which I think most of us live in, we deal in 2 to 3 week driven sprints. So how plausible, likely, or even possible is it to write and execute test cases as was done in the past? In other words, manual test case creation and execution. Can it even be done successfully? It might depend on the company, but the way software development has evolved into now, manual test cases might be too slow to really keep up with the demands of an agile system. So a good replacement for that is exploratory testing. And this seems to be a good solution for the sprint-driven test process. The reality is that exploratory testing isn't just clicking here and there and basically saying, yeah, everything seems fine. I try to get a lot of companies out of that world of, yes, this seems fine testing. So you need to create a lot of test charters to organize exploratory testing. It's not just point and click haphazardly, but it is an organized system of rapid testing. There are numerous exploratory testing articles that you can find everywhere that can bring the process of testing the basic system as soon as it becomes ready into good focus, where you can start reporting a lot of bugs and even making reports out of your exploratory testing charters. But the question I ask is, can you start automating right away? In my opinion, you first have to have an exploratory testing phase, if you want to call it. It doesn't necessarily have to follow in parallel, basically in threads, but you can run exploratory testing and test automation in threads. In parallel, you can use your exploratory testing to provide information about your system. And that contrasts to a lot of test automation people I've known, very good people who are very skillful at what they do, but a lot of these people start to automate their tests right away without really testing if the underlying system is stable enough for automation, or if it even has been verified and validated. So test automation might begin too early. And we can talk about the speed of test creation. Test creation in this instance, meaning test automation, we can ask, is fast test creation always good? And we can debate, is speed good or speed is bad? Though I see it in the speed is good world, speed means you have faster test creation and execution. You can start gaining information about your system under test by quickly creating and executing tests. Tests can be maintained in pace with development. You don't have to have the world of we're going to first develop and then there's going to be testing done afterwards. Testing and development can keep in pace with each other. They can develop in parallel. And you can even write tests first and then make sure that the development passes those tests. There are very good articles and even books now on test-driven development. And you can also, with fast test development, create easy automation reports that'll give you immediate information about your system. But there's also another side. Let's talk about whether speed can be bad in the world of test automation. Often there's not enough time to stop and examine the system before automating the tests. I've come across very many tests where basically bugs aren't found, but the opposite happens. It's like bugs are automated. In other words, that an unexpected result isn't marked as a bug by an assertion or verification point, but the bug is almost included as part of the system. And often not enough tests are created if there isn't enough speed given into a system. And also there are too many brittle UI tests that often give false results regarding a failed test. So what can we do? We should first stop and find this a good time as any to stop and ponder the question about defining successful DevOps test automation. We really need to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? Maybe we should have asked this earlier, but we have to ask, really, why are we doing this? What is the point of all this? Why are we doing test automation, especially in the DevOps world? One thing we have to keep in mind is to try to keep ourselves from doing ineffective test automation. Too often, to satisfy that test part in the DevOps test automation, sometimes there's just too much ineffective test automation. In projects that I've seen, in companies that I've seen, often test automation is simply done to just satisfy the requirements. In other words, a client will ask a company, will ask a project, did you test this certain product? Or how have you tested your software? And very often test automation is often used as almost like a kind of weird catchphrase. People often say, of course we tested. We have very quick and efficient test automation with dozens or even hundreds or even thousands of tests, I've heard in even. And so test automation is often used just so a company can claim to have test automation. And in no way does test automation automatically mean effective, efficient, and good testing. And I've seen numerous examples of test automation, many of which need to be avoided. I've seen test automation that literally doesn't give any results. I've seen tests run on a laptop, literally on an unoccupied desk in a tucked away corner of an office without anyone even checking the results. I've seen examples of test automation where all the tests have failed. There are literally hundreds of tests, none of which have been maintained, and literally all the tests fail. And literally the testers are actually the developers, to be quite frank. The developers who write these test automation sets often say, oh, we just ignore those. We just don't pay any attention to it. They'll claim they have test automation, but at the same time, they'll claim to ignore the failed tests that they get. And I've even seen test automation sets where no tests are actually run at all. So how can we avoid these negative test scenarios? A friend of mine says that test automation is a lot like gardening. Because in gardening, from what I've been told, there is a lot of basic work like weeding, watering, and replanting. In other words, the grunt work, the not so exciting, the not so thrilling work that needs to build a foundation for the garden, or in our case, for the test automation bed to be stable. The way I see it is test automation is a lot like car maintenance. Because the way I think of test automation, like auto maintenance, is like for a car to run smoothly, to run well, there's a lot of small work that has to go into creating and maintaining an efficient and smoothly running engine. Tune-ups are not fun, but they're necessary. And so what we have to do with our test automation sets is to constantly tune them up, make sure that they work. And the way I've always seen it is the same way with test automation. I'm of the school where just as important, if not more important, in my opinion, is observing and automating your results. You have to look at your results. In other words, you have to look at your results and see if any tests failed. And if they did fail, you have to ask why. Was there something wrong with the test? Was the system running slowly? Was there some kind of server error? Or did you find a bug that needs to be reported for fixing? Too many people, I think, regard test automation as something that does the testing for you. And in reality, test automation is you testing. And one thing that I've always loved about test automation is that you can use your coding skill and your creativity to run and to create and run any kind of test that's necessary. And you can create as many of these as you have time for, and you can execute them under numerous circumstances with numerous input, gendering different kinds of output to see if you're getting the expected results. And the idea that you can just run test automation is the same that you can just basically just keep driving a car without doing any engine or car maintenance or any kind of maintenance or even examining your results. In the end, you'll just get disastrous results. Very often I've seen practices where tests have been basically just kind of shoved into a big test regression set. And eventually you'll have hundreds and hundreds of tests. At that point, maintenance will be too big and too difficult of an issue, and you really won't be able to gain any satisfactory results from your tests if you're just running just tests that don't have anything to do with anything. In other words, even though we're doing test automation, we still have to satisfy business requirements, and we still have to test the way an end user would use the system. In other words, we have to put in the same kind of inputs and see the expected and actual results that an actual end user will get from using the system. So let's recap that. I want to really stress that. Another test automation method to avoid are automated test sets that don't actually test any business requirements or do any actual end user activities. Just like in the old days, when you created a test case, you had to link it to a business requirement. We're still doing that. We still should be doing that, I should say. So tie your test, make sure your test automated, each individual test, as well as the test set can be tied to a business requirement. And the question I have is that there is a different kind of system developing, because test automation, yes, is often done by testers. It's sometimes done by developers, depending on the company. There are companies where basically the tester, the QA person, the quality engineer, the title really just depends on the company. That person basically now kind of oversees the testing environment. They oversee what kind of tests are written, and they'll tell the developer to create more tests in certain areas to satisfy a business requirement. And there are also different roles. There's a software developer, software engineer in test, software development engineer in test, and also just the old-fashioned QA person who writes tests and test automation sets. And there is still the common belief that and even a hiring practice these days. Some companies really do regard developers by default even to also be testers. So very often the developers will write tests to basically confirm that their system is working. Whereas us QA people want to write tests and create tests and execute test sets to find bugs. So we can discuss, are developers the worst testers? Are testers really going to be as skillful in coding as a developer? Whether that's a true or false dichotomy, we don't know. It's hard to tell now. But developers are often tasked to do test automation, and I think it's up to us to show our coding abilities now that we can basically operate in the best of both worlds. In other words, we can be good testers. We have that kind of eye towards testing. And we can also write good tests. We can code just as well as anyone else can. And so what do we have to do to really have a good, successful DevOps test automation practice? As I stressed before, and I'll stress again, we have to have independent verification of business requirements. That's what we do. We ensure a reliably functioning system in a way that functions the way the end users expect. So in other words, we have verification versus validation points. I think that's kind of an old point, because I remember when I was first getting my education in testing. One thing that it surprises me how many people are amazed at this, but a lot of people out there don't know that you can actually get certified in software testing, that there is software testing certification. And part of this education of software testing is to know the difference between verification versus validation and be able to do both. Let's start off as well. After bringing this up, let's talk about what verification is versus validation. Let's start with verification. Verification is the process we can define really to determine if the software is defined and designed and developed as the requirements specify. So in other words, we can ask, do we have the right system? Are we developing what the end user really wants? Are we developing what the client wants? It's just as bad of a system as any kind of weird buggy system. So that's still verification. Do we have the right system? We need to ask ourselves constantly, are we building what the client or end user wants? And let's contrast this with validation. Validation is basically just the process of checking to see if the software meets the client needs and expectations. In other words, does the system work right? You have to make sure you're designing the system that the user wants, and verification. And validating it basically means, does this system work as expected? In other words, again, does a system we just built work reliably in the way an end user would expect it to work? Basically, that can be boiled down into just asking, are there any bugs? Are there any bugs? Is there anything really stopping the system from working as expected? So our test automation sets have to validate that the system that we're testing is what the end user wants. And we also have to verify that the system works cleanly and reliably, and that our tests find bugs. I remember being taught that that is the sign of a good test. A good test finds bugs. A good tester, a good quality assurance person, a good quality engineer, use the definition you want, but a good quality assurance person finds bugs. And we have to make sure that our test automation set does that. That we're constantly finding bugs. It's kind of out of the scope of this talk. Basically, another talk is like, what is a bug? There have practically been books written about that, but we have to make sure that our tests don't run just to run. A good test automation set doesn't just pass. A good test automation set basically just always can find something wrong eventually. And so how do we also, in another way, define a successful DevOps test automation set? A successful DevOps testing basically means you have, in a company, different roles, and all these different roles have different ideas of what success is. You have, in a company, in a software development company, the top level people. We can call them the CEOs, CTOs, presidents, whatever title, etc. And what they're concerned is the inflow of sales, sales possibilities, new clients, new customers. In other words, just money. We have to make sure that the top level people see that the company is producing excellent software and that that's opening new sales opportunities and profit opportunities. So we can start off our system basically pleasing, people at the very top, the CEOs, presidents, owners, CTOs, anyone at the C level. But there are other roles that we have to deal with ourselves. For example, project management. We have to think of a project manager in terms of the successful completion of business requirements from our run in test execution, test automation. And we have to make sure that the features and capabilities that we were tasked to create have been created. And they all work as expected according to the clients and their end users. So we have to satisfy project management not as on a high level as the business owners, because we have to make sure that the business requirements and all the features and capabilities that our project was tasked to create have been created. They're the features that the clients and their end users want, and that they all work reliably. We also have to satisfy development. In other words, we have to show that we've built working code, and we also want the developers to know that we've been working with them. There shouldn't be, I should say, any kind of adversarial relationship between working code versus good testing. Testing makes for better code. That's what I've always said, and that's the goal for my testing. I want to make the developer's life as easy as possible, and to show that their code that they wrote does work. And of course, there's a whole idea of QA. My satisfaction comes with knowing that there were a lot of bugs found, that I did create reports that showed throughout the sprint, throughout the development cycle, that bugs were found, and also to point out where there was stability in the system. So you have to satisfy numerous roles. Success in DevOps doesn't mean just a lot of bugs were found, or that there was good software where no bugs or few bugs were reported, but you're satisfying different people at different levels through your tests. And also in DevOps, you're also satisfying. We've been basically concentrating on the dev part of DevOps because that's where we are. That's where test is. But you also have to satisfy the ops side. You have to make sure that the system runs well and that there aren't going to be any difficulties in configuration, database management, servers, everything on that side also. And also, yeah, we have to satisfy, we can't forget about this side. We also have to satisfy the client because the client needs a reliable system, the one that they ordered, that has, well, few to no errors and functions as the end users wish. So we have to satisfy everybody from our own management, our own company ownership to the client company ownership, and also their end users also. So there are numerous targets, there are numerous goals in a successful DevOps test automation. When you're testing, you have to keep all of these roles in mind. You can't just think, I gotta find bugs. I found bugs, everybody's happy. It's okay to do that. Of course, finding bugs is good, but you also have to make sure that you're finding bugs in the system that the client ordered and the one that satisfies the business requirements that the end users want in the first place. So in conclusion, we can ask the question again, why are we doing this? What is the point of all this? We've tried to show in this sprint that test DevOps can create a lot of tests very quickly. It can create a lot of accurate tests that gauge the stability of the system. And that can provide good reports that basically both verify and validate a system, and to prove that you have it's difficult to prove, but to really show that you have the system that the end user always wanted in the first place, and that it functions well, and it's the one that the user wants, and it's the one that is as bug-free as we can possibly find it. So that's my speech. That's my talk about defining a successful DevOps operation. I hope you got a lot out of it, and thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us for this virtual bonus session. We hope you enjoyed it. Learn more about InflectraCON, our live, in-person conference from April 19th through the 21st, 2023 in Washington, D.C. by visiting InflectraCON.com. Stay tuned for more great content, news, and events from Inflectra. Learn more at inflectra.com/company.